Assalamu alaikum, greetings and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our webinar on Occupied Behind Bars, Detention as a Tool of Oppression in Kashmir and Palestine. My name is Ahmed Ramadan. I work for Justice for All as the Advocacy Officer for the GTA and Policy Advisor for the Palestine Campaign. I have the honor of moderating this panel today. Thank you for joining us as we delve into a critical issue affecting both regions: the use of imprisonment as a mechanism of political repression. We are privileged to hear from a remarkable lineup of speakers who will share their insights, research, and experiences. Our discussion will examine various forms of repression faced by prisoners and their families, from physical torture to psychological trauma. Additionally, we will dive into the ways legal frameworks are deployed to legitimize detentions. Imprisonment is not just a means of punishment, brothers and sisters. It is often a strategic tool used to stifle dissent and control communities. In Kashmir and in Palestine, we see how legal frameworks are manipulated to justify detentions and suppress resistance. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight some striking parallels between these two struggles. Both Kashmir and Palestine have suffered from colonial legacies that led to mass displacement and ongoing conflicts. The tactics used by the occupying forces, arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and demographic changes are alarmingly similar. This long-standing bond of solidarity between Kashmiris and Palestinians reminds us that their fights for justice are interconnected. Our panelists are outstanding speakers from these two occupied areas. They will provide us with invaluable insights into the realities and the impact of detention practices on individuals, families, and communities. So, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Athar Zia. Dr. Athar hails from the Valley of Kashmir. She is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist, an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado Greeley. She is also the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir. Athar is the founder, editor of Kashmir Lit, and co-founder of the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective. I'd like us to welcome Dr. Athar Zia.
Thank you so much, Brother Ahmad, and Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum assalam.
So I'd like to thank the organizers at Justice for All for organizing this panel and getting us together, representing Kashmir and Palestine. And I would also like to take a moment of all of yours, a little time from you to say a little prayer for the martyrs of Gaza and Palestine, and also think and keep in hearts the people who are occupied from Turtle Island all across the world, including Kashmir and Palestine. So having said that, the topic that we've all gathered to get together today to talk about is about detentions, and it's about political prisoners. And what I think would be a good starting point, as you have already pointed out, that there's many similarities between Palestine and Kashmir, and it's not just to draw the similarity in this moment when the world is looking towards Palestine, but there is a 77-year plus solid kindredhood between Palestine and Kashmir, because both of them are anti-colonial movements against imperial globality, which has been growing in the last 100 years. And also, they are two of the oldest issues on the agenda of United Nations. Now, we all know that United Nations, rather than a post-colonial institution, is really a tool of neocolonialism, but we will have to invoke it from time to time because that's how imperial globality works. So when we look at the two carceral regimes that are prevalent in Palestine and in Kashmir, we see the centrality of administrative detention. And for those of you who are not introduced to Palestine or Kashmir in that idiom, Administrative detention is something where you take people as prisoners and put them into jails without any without any crime that's been committed, and you can put them in jails without any courts, without any legal rulings, and you can just put them there and you don't even have to hear from them for the rest of the time, as has happened in Kashmir and Palestine, that you have political prisoners that have not seen the light of the day. We have a panelist here, both of whose parents are under several laws, but the overarching law is administrative detention, and then you kind of like slap them with different charges, most of which are framed and trumped up. So that's kind of like at the heart of how you get so many political prisoners. As we see in Palestine, you have more than 8,000 in the recent times. And of course, that's not just the only statistic. Kashmir is another part of this imperial global system that we are living in this moment, or neocolonialism, if you might want to call it. What you see in Kashmir happening at the moment is that there is not even any human rights organization that could actually take stock of what's happening and how many political prisoners we have right now. And when I say we do not have human rights organization, that doesn't mean we don't have the organizations and activists, but most of them who did this kind of work are in jail. And again, they are in jails because of earlier on, what you had at the heart of it was administrative detention, but now they are fully in jails under trumped up charges. And we don't even know what's happening on ground, if not for some of the people who would be doing the documentation. Now, how did it come about in Kashmir that you have, at one point in time, as Amnesty International reported, more than 17,000 detainees inside the jails, inside Kashmir and outside? That's another part of it, that whether you want to keep them inside Kashmir or you want to throw them into jails in India, and that creates another level of separation from people at their homes and with their organizations as well. So when we think about Kashmir, we have to go back to 1947, and then we also have to think about the autonomous agreement that happened with Indian regime. And within that autonomous or semi-autonomous agreement, you also had, which was kind of seen as a protection for Kashmir by many of the client politicians who signed the agreement at that time. But part of it was also a Trojan horse, while it kind of gave Kashmir its territorial sovereignty, which lasted till 2019. And part of the autonomy agreement was also very nominal, that India was already ruling Kashmir the way it wanted. But at the same time, what that autonomous agreement did was, it was a Trojan horse, so to speak. What it brought inside Kashmir was also preventative detention, administrative detention. Now, the Indian fundamental rights are very unique, that they have preventive detention woven into it. So anyone suspected of even kind of like breathing and just resisting within can be detained and thrown into jail. And that kind of like started the moment that treaty went into effect. It actually ate, let's say, it actually took those people, it ate the very client politicians themselves. They were also detained after that. Once they signed, like once the utility was gone, they were themselves put in detention. And that has been the history in Kashmir, that most of the people who have even written or said something against the Indian government get detained, get thrown into the jail, and then they have a rotating kind of situation, that one case ends, the another one starts. So they have these lawless laws, as they have been called, like the Public Safety Act. These names are very misleading. Public Safety Act, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is kind of like the big one these days. They all are part of the same detention legal structure that they have created, which is basically an illegal structure. So, and it's also like administrative detention when you kind of think about it, but it is a very lawless law for people living under occupations. And Kashmir's occupation is also very difficult for a lot of people to understand, because India is considered to be one of the democracies in South Asia. But we know how it has created an authoritarian system inside Kashmir, where it weaponizes democracy. And part of that is incarcerating people. And now when we think about Kashmir in this moment, a lot of people think that the exacerbation in Kashmir and the kind of situation of silencing, of persecution and repression is going on from 2019 in a sort of like in a more visible manner. And I think what we also need to understand is that from 1947 onwards, there have been different phases for Kashmiris as they have gone through different iterations of repression and of course taking away their basic human rights and civil and political rights by the Indian administration. There have been several iterations, so there have been different phases. So the very recent phase is from 2019 onwards, where you have this visibly a Hindu supremacist government. Before that, there were secular, quote unquote, secular governments, but all those governments had the same kind of discretion towards Kashmir, but it was done in a very discreet format. This time round, there is no holds barred. They're very visible, they're very brazen in their strategy. But before that, so we have to keep that in mind as well. So we've always had political prisoners in Kashmir. And sadly, many of them, the way they are detained, they are made to look like as if they're just routine criminals and routine thugs. And then Kashmir is not unique, but it is a sad situation that we've also had some very remarkable leaders who have been hanged and who were jailed and then hanged, like Makbul Bhatt was there, and then we had Afzal Guru in 2013, and even their bodies are interred in jails. So that's kind of another thing, that not only is the carceral regime operating on the living body, but it also is not allowing the dead to be released from jails. And so that's kind of a situation in Kashmir that we kind of see in different iterations, that these political prisoners who are there without anyone representing them, even if there are lawyers who might want to fight their cases, they are also under harassment. And what we see in the last 33 years after 1989, when the armed phase of the struggle began, what is happening is that even the lawyers, currently you have the Bar Association of Kashmir, which was disbanded. And because many of the lawyers were sympathetic to the political prisoners and were fighting their cases, and now even the lawyers are inside jails. So that's the level that we have reached. On the other hand, the human rights activists who used to fight these cases, document these cases, and kind of provide evidence, they are also in jails. So after 2019, what has happened is everything that Indian government used to do in Kashmir, it's been spiked not just a notch, but it's kind of touching heights in this moment. If you think about the level of repression, if you think about the laws, so everything is kind of coming to head in this moment, and you have no lawyers to fight the cases. And even if someone is fighting a case for a political prisoner, they also are harassed and humiliated in some ways and persecuted. So slowly and steadily, the space is being taken away, and the dispossession in this moment is looming not just large, but people are facing a very rank settler colonial regime in this moment, which has taken away their territorial sovereignty in 2019. Before that, there was a very discrete process of dispossession. So if you think about Kashmir in this moment, you have the Indian Army occupying the size of Dallas inside this region. And then you also have, after 2019, because territorial sovereignty is gone, very recently there were elections, and they have kind of cobbled together this local government, but they do not have much powers. The power resides with New Delhi. And what we are seeing is this opening up of new ways and new forms of dispossession, which were already there, but now they're being taken to new heights. So you have administrative detention happening even for a Facebook post. So from a Facebook post to someone openly dissenting with India regarding Kashmir's self-determination, you have everyone in jail. And the saddest part is that we don't even know how many people we have in jail currently. At one point, Amnesty and local human rights organizations were reporting numbers in 15 to 17,000. But in this moment, we do not have current statistics to kind of think with. But we do have a lot of documentation and archives in different places which are safe, and we can kind of like, but the other part is that even those archives and documents that have been publicly produced on websites and reports, they're all gone because most of the archives have been disappeared from the internet. And that's another level of repression where the documentation around Kashmir is going away, unless it's a positive documentation favoring India, then it finds audience. So journalists who would do this kind of work, they're also under different laws because they have to report India in positive light. If they are reporting something that is on ground, they're talking about this repression. They're talking about detentions that are happening. They are either jailed or they are put under UAPA. And we have had several journalists, and we still have several journalists who are jailed, and the ones who are allowed out at some point, they are completely defined, so to speak, and they can't speak after that because they don't have the means, they don't have jobs. That people are dismissed if they speak from government jobs. People's properties are confiscated, and if nothing at all, fake charges get slapped against people and they get thrown into jail. So that's, if you kind of think about different bars in this bird cage, administrative detention as it is called, or preventative detention, which is basically an illegal way of keeping people out of circulation, especially those people who are opinion leaders. So currently in Kashmir, we do not have, as they say, civil society. There is society, there are people are silenced. There is a huge swath of government employees, and government jobs are the only jobs that have been allowed to grow inside Kashmir, because then you also are creating this constituency which has nothing else to do but to do their jobs and also make sure that they don't lose their jobs by speaking against the government. Then you have the police. That's the only other department in Kashmir that has grown exponentially in the last 33 years, but that is now under direct New Delhi rule. So when you see that, and then you see who are these other people, most of them are jailed. And what about the civil society that would speak about this? That is also mostly jailed.
So can
So
I ask you a question?
yeah.
How do you feel like what's taking place? Just wanted to hear your reflections and your thoughts about the erasure of the Kashmir in and of itself, and the politics of erasure in that sense.
Oh, you mean, is the question done?
Yes, yes.
Well, I think politics of erasure is part of colonialism. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to erase the archives, the documentation, people who would speak, and people who are continuing to speak. If they are going out, they cannot go back in, so they are in informal exile. People who are inside, they can speak. So politics of erasure is a big part of a colonial regime, the colonial system. They want to everything that has been documented in the last 33 years and also 70 plus years is completely gone. And when I say completely gone, I don't mean to say that it doesn't exist in places and people are not in their small or big ways trying to speak, but overarching rules that have been made, especially against the law, especially against the press, especially against the kind of like the administrations, the structure that has been created inside Kashmir. No one can easily talk. And whoever is talking is getting thrown into the jail. And that's the experience of people in the last 2-3 years, increasingly. And before that, we've had a lot of people who have been thrown into jails for speaking, for fighting cases, or even, being pro-resistance and doing the things that people needed to do for their self-determination. So politics of erasure in this moment, it's a very insidious way in which Kashmiris are being dispossessed, where they are not even allowed to keep the archives, where they're not allowed to even write the smallest post on social media to document what's happening. And that is part of the colonial regime. And I think if we don't become cognizant of this disappearance of Kashmiri writing, disappearance of archives, we are going to face a time when we look back when the posterity looks back, this period is completely going to be invisibilized. It has happened over and over, like you mentioned the website, Kashmir Lit. which gets hacked every 3-4 months, and the archives are lost, and we have to kind of cobble them together from different Wayback Machines sometimes. And the level of hacking and the level of erasure is so bad, I mean, high tech, that it's almost like these websites and these pages never existed. There is a journalist in Kashmir who woke up one morning, and very skilled, competent journalist, a deep, Kashmiri to core, and who knows the ground. He woke up one morning and most of his articles were completely gone. And that is happening over and over with people. We have a journalist, Irfan Miraj, who had a website called Vanda.com, and Vanda means winter, and it was mostly critical pieces, reflective pieces, but also a lot of literature. He's thrown into jail, and his website is gone as well. Then you have Khurram Parvez, who is one of the preeminent human rights defenders, and they have a website which which is, you can't open these website inside Kashmir or inside India. Then outside, sometimes you may or may not be able to open it, and mostly the archives are gone every now and then. And there are sympathizers and people who might save some parts of these write-ups and parts of these archives to bring them back. But it's a constant battle. And then you also have newspapers who have lost their archives. Kashmir Times comes to my mind. They're actually trying to rebuild their archive in this moment as we speak. So the erasure is happening at the level where the professionals who were trying to publish either newspapers or books, that's really trickled down. What we have seen in the last 3-4 years is that people are not even writing. We had an edited volume that should have been coming out now, or should have come out. There were 12 or 13 articles written by local academics, and they could not publish them. They had to withdraw their articles because they thought that they're going to be persecuted, and that has been happening. We have Professor Sheikh Shaukat, who actually started the human rights certificate in University of Kashmir and was teaching at the University of Kashmir. He got dismissed very recently because of his the opinions and that he had given about Kashmir and self-determination and about the independence of Kashmir. And side by side in that case is also Arundhati Roy, because she's also accused of the same. But Sheikh Shaukat is not talked about as much because being inside Kashmir, he doesn't have that level of visibility. And there's no one to really write about it, because there is no one to write and no one to really report. So whatever you're hearing from Kashmir in this moment is so motivated. It's so it's shaped in the way that India wants to, and you can also see that reflect on social media, where you
Yeah,
have
the
I'm
amount of
sorry.
knowledge, I'm saying the amount of knowledge and information that you have just goes to show how much more work needs to be done and education needs to happen. So really thank you, Dr. Ether, for your profound reflections on the detention in Kashmir and the politics of erasure. In this region, enforced detention and disappearances are commonplace. They serve a clear political purpose to erase Kashmiri culture, people, politics. Families are torn apart, and entire communities live in fear of losing their loved ones without a trace. I want to move, just before we move on to our second speaker, I wanted to make an announcement that any of our viewers, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. If there's a specific speaker you want us to ask that question to, just make sure you mention that in the comments. Now we'll turn our attention to our second speaker in Palestine, and welcome Jenna Abu Hasna. Jenna Abu Hasna holds a PhD and is a dedicated Palestinian human rights activist and advocate at the Ad-Damir Prisoners Support and Human Rights Association. It's a Palestinian NGO based in Ramallah that highlights the rights of Palestinian prisoners. With a major in human rights and international law, she serves as the International Advocacy Officer of Ad-Damir, where she is committed to enabling justice for Palestinian prisoners. Her work has been published in outlets like the New Arab. Please welcome Jenna Abu Hasna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction as well. I want to start off by thanking Dr. Athar for her explanation into the basically conditions and the situation right now in Kashmir, and to highlight how, astounding it is every time to hear the comparisons and the similarities between the political prisoners here that are under the Israeli occupation, the Palestinian detainees, and the similarities of the occupational regime that we have to go through here in Palestine and as well in Kashmir, especially when it comes to the use of administrative detention against Palestinians and as well against Kashmiris, and also the withholding of bodies of the detainees or targeting uh, any sort of Palestinian for social media, the use of social media and what they share on social media, and targeting human rights defenders, anyone that will basically try to raise awareness and bring us a spotlight on all of the violations that Palestinians go through on a day-to-day basis. So I'll continue by sort of explaining the organization of the Mir and the work that we do for those who don't know. So as mentioned, the Mir is a nonprofit organization based here in Palestine in Ramallah. We work towards providing free legal aid to Palestinian detainees that are detained by the occupation across all of their prisons. And also representing these detainees in apartheid military courts, and advocating for their rights and highlighting all of the violations that they are currently undergoing, especially after October 7th. It's very important to know, obviously, that all of the violations that I'm going to speak about have been occurring against Palestinians since the establishment of the occupying state, since the use of administrative detention against Palestinian detainees, since the use of even detaining and targeting any Palestinian for any small minor sort of act that the occupation claims is a violent act that threatens the security of the occupying state. The first main aim is explaining military courts and the very difficult order that is administrative detention. I know Dr. Athar sort of explained a little bit about what administrative detention is, but to get a bit more into the sort of deeper aspect, administrative detention is an order that allows the occupation to detain any Palestinian, no matter age or gender, and sentence them to 3 to 6 months of detention within the prisons based on no charge or no evidence held against the detainee. So the occupation states that they hold secret evidence that is kept in a secret file that the lawyer and the detainee have absolutely no access to whatsoever. And the evidence that they claim to have, they claim that it is sort of evident that this specific Palestinian is a threat to the security of a nation. And to note that the current youngest Palestinian that is serving under 4 months of administrative detention is 14 years old. So no matter your background, no matter your age, you can be seen as a threat to the security of a whole entire state, it would seem. So yeah, during these trials, sort of per se, in these military courts that are only basically established for the aim of trying Palestinians and absolutely do not try any of the occupation's own settlers, meaning that this is obviously a apartheid system that is built on unfair trial guarantees and illegal in the sense also violating international law in the sense that only Palestinians are tried in these military courts. Israeli settlers that are in occupied territories that under international law should also be tried in these courts are absolutely not tried in these courts and are actually tried in the occupation civil courts. So that as well just creates basically a system that is completely separate and discriminatory based on obviously discriminatory claims against Palestinians just for the fact that you are a Palestinian, that the occupation sees as a threat. And when detainees are not given administrative detention, they can be given prolonged sentences up to 20 plus years for any act that the occupation claims is sort of inciting violence. So even posts on social media can be seen as inciting violence, and sort of the occupation can easily then charge you with 1 to 5 years of prison sentencing just for liking a post on social media, just for sharing a post on social media. And the post could be something completely just showing solidarity for the ongoing genocide in Gaza, or raising awareness around the everyday violations that Palestinians are being subjected to. And I sort of jumped from my first claim of my first explanation of what administrative detention is, but to go back to that, so any detainee can be given 3 to 6 months of administrative detention based on no evidence that is kept in a secret file. And then once if a detainee was charged with, was given an order of 3 months or 6 months, once they ultimately serve the entire time period in the prisons, and of course, this creates administrative detention is one of the most difficult sort of orders for Palestinian lawyers to build a defense case, because obviously it's again built on no evidence, or the occupation does not release any information to the lawyer, so they have nothing to sort of build their defense on. And once the detainee serves the entire period that they were ordered to, a review will take place, a judicial review will take place, in which the detainee is again brought to these military courts, and trials for administrative detention are not public whatsoever, which is also another violation, as everyone has the right to a fair and public trial hearing. However, that is not the case for Palestinians that are charged with administrative detention. And once the judicial review takes place, the occupation's Israeli judge or prosecutor can review, sort of between quotations, review the case and determine whether or not that this detainee will serve another 3 to 6 months or will be released. And majority of the times, of course, the case is that the detainee is extended for their detention, and this continues on indefinitely for as long as the occupation wants. There's no sort of set time frame that the occupation abides by. Any Palestinian can be sitting in prison under administrative detention for years on end. We've had plenty of detainees that have served administrative detention for 2+ years. And to get a bit into the numbers as well, so before October 7th, there were a total of 5,000 Palestinian detainees across all of the occupation's prisons. And of those 5,000 detainees, we had a little bit over 1,000 administrative detainees. However, now currently today, there are 10,100 Palestinian detainees in total across all prisons. And of course, this number is changing every single day. Every single day, the occupation carries out mass arrest campaigns in which they target any Palestinian for detention and for arrests. And these arrest campaigns are very violent in nature. Not only is the detainee targeted, but their family members are targeted as well. The areas that they live in are targeted as well. Complete destruction of their villages, of their cities, of their homes. During the violent arrest campaigns, the occupation forces will forcefully enter these homes and subject the family members of the detainee to very brutal beatings, degrading treatment, insults, threats against them as well, use of sexual violence against them. And that is also how they gain control over the detainees and sort of force them to comply with any of their demands, which is using their family members as threats against them. So from the 10,100 detainees that we have, and this number is growing again every single day, we have around 4,000, a little bit over 4,000 administrative detainees. So the numbers that we are currently at right now are numbers that have never been seen before, especially all at once within the time period of 1 year. So the time frame of 1 year. This has resulted in a lot of difficult situations within the occupation's prisons, which is the first example would be the overcrowding situation within all of the prisons. You know, these facilities, these detention centers are not built to contain the amount of detainees that they're holding. So cells that are meant for 3 to 4 people are currently holding 15 plus people at a time. So this results in even more difficult situations down the line, because this plays into the medical neglect, it plays into the hygiene, the unhygienic situations within the prisons, which leads to illnesses rapidly spreading within the prisons, which is currently what is happening, especially with the most common disease that is being spread, which is the scabies disease. Detainees are rapidly being infected with this disease because they're being transferred every single day from cell to cell. They're forced to share clothes, they're forced to share towels, they're not being provided with shower times. They're allowed to shower maybe once a week, especially during the beginning of the genocidal year. The detainees were not being provided with any shower time whatsoever. All of their personal belongings were completely confiscated. They were not being given a change of clothes for months on end. Their undergarments as well were not being provided to them. And for the female detainees, their sanitary products were not being provided to them as well. We have 95 female detainees that are currently imprisoned by the occupation, over 250 children that are also detained by the occupation. From the 95 female detainees, we have 30 that are under administrative detention. And for the children, we have almost 40 children that are under administrative detention as well. And when it comes to the detainees that are taken from Gaza, the detainees that were taken from Gaza were subjected to enforced disappearance for about 6 months, and there are still thousands more that are subjected to enforced disappearance where no human rights organization, no family member, no lawyer has access to any information revolving around these detainees that were forcefully taken from Gaza and then held in areas that no one has any idea of where these locations are. It was not until March of this year that, or May of this year actually, that lawyers were given access to some of the detainees that the occupation is holding, and were able to find out more information and more conditions, and for the detainees as well, to find out what is going on with their family members, whether their family members are alive or not. Many detainees were told by the occupation's forces or by the IPS officers as well. They were told by them that their family members were bombed, were killed, were targeted, were shot at, and they were, sort of tormented with this information as well, saying, you're never going to see your family members. We killed them before we took you. So this is obviously just another way for the occupation to gain control over the detainees, not just physically, but psychologically as well. So using psychological torture alongside the physical torture against the detainees. So the occupation, up until today, we have no idea what is the real number that the occupation, the real number of detainees that the occupation is currently holding from those that were taken from Gaza. The 10,000 plus detainees that are here do not contain the detainees from Gaza. These are only Palestinians that are taken from the West Bank and other occupied territories. For the detainees from Gaza, the occupation claims that they have around 4,000 detainees. However, it is very likely that the number is much, much higher than this. And when it comes to the amount of deaths that have occurred since last year, since October 7th, the confirmed number of deaths that we know of their identities is around 28 detainees that have been killed during their detention. This is due to the starvation policy that detainees are being subjected to, the medical neglect, the physical torture and attacks, the everyday brutal attacks by the occupation, by their occupation forces, by their IPS officers as well. And obviously, this is due to the fact that the occupying state has been allowed to escape accountability because no international third party has intervened in any and anything that is currently going on, especially since last year from October 7th. So the occupation continues with impunity. They continue to commit the crimes that they're committing, and very publicly as well. The use of social media by the occupation's forces, the occupation forces will personally record what the crimes that they're committing against the detainees. So they'll personally record and post on their personal social media accounts the active violations that they're committing against the detainees, the beatings, the torment, the insults, forcing the detainees to bark like dogs, forcing the detainees to insult their family members, forcing the detainees to insult themselves, to curse themselves. And they'll go and openly publish this on their online social media accounts, and then again do not face any accountability whatsoever. When the occupation states the claims that they will open an investigation, for example, like the case that we saw in the Detention military camp, which is one of the military camps that the occupation opened after October 7th. So two previous military bases were were converted into military camps by the occupation in order to detain the detainees from Gaza specifically, meaning that the detainees were held in makeshift open cages, completely nude, blindfolded the entirety of their detention, handcuffed as well. The sexual assault and the rape that they were committing against all of the detainees. When one of the cases was finally sort of exposed, in which a detainee was assaulted and raped by the occupation forces, 10 plus soldiers from the occupation forces actively committed this crime against detainees, against the detainee, and the occupation claimed that they're going to open an investigation against the soldiers that committed this crime. However, 99% of the time, these sort of investigations that are opened by the occupation are almost always closed due to the occupation claiming that there is a lack of evidence that these crimes were actually committed. So these are only a few of the violations being committed, and the ways that the occupation has escaped accountability for all of the crimes.
I think
Also,
it's hard for us to really realize or even understand the situation and the conditions that a lot of these detainees and prisoners go through, unfortunately. And, you know, when you were talking, and I'm thinking about it also, really the difference between these indefinite detainees and the hostages is they do not plan to give a lot of these, unfortunately, a lot of these detainees back. So I really wanted to thank you on shedding light on the conditions that detainees live through and the systems that the occupation uses in order to oppress the Palestinian people. But you know, the situation not only affects the prisoners, it also traumatizes their families and communities. And it reminds us that the fight for justice is about restoring dignity and humanity for all. So I really wanted to thank you for, you know, shedding that light. I wanted to move on to our next speaker, Ahmed bin Qasim. Ahmed is a writer and a student of anthropology from Kashmir. He is the founder and host of the Kosher Musalman podcast, one of the first podcasts in Kashmir region that highlights themes of colonialism and liberation struggle. Ahmed is also the son of two Kashmiri political prisoners, with his father being Kashmir's longest-serving political prisoner, a heartbreaking distinction. His work has been published in outlets like The Nation, Yaqeen Institute, and Ummatics. Please welcome Ahmed bin Qasim.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to start by saying that when we speak about political prisoners, we're not talking about case files. We're not talking about statistics. We're not talking about numbers. We are not talking about archives. We're talking about living, breathing people who happen to be our fathers, our mothers, for some happen to be their children, for some happens to be their siblings, for some it is their neighbor who they haven't seen for the past 5 or 6 years. For some it happens to be their friend who all of a sudden was detained in Kashmir or in Palestine, but I would limit myself to talking about Kashmir here. So the first thing to kind of register and acknowledge is that when we speak about prisoners, we're talking about homes that have been broken. We're talking about families that have been torn apart. Torn apart. We're talking about a child who has to go to prisons, different prisons, or a small daughter who has to go to prison to see her own father or her own mother. And while she goes to the prison to be subjected to frisking before she has to meet her own mother or her own father, to be told that she's only allowed to meet for 15 minutes or 30 minutes by a stranger who happens to dictate the terms of the mulaqat or the meeting, as it's called. Um, for this small child to be told that you cannot see your father or you cannot talk to your mother except through the bars, except through the glass, that you can see your mother or your father, but you cannot touch them. So, this is the first thing that we have to register, that we're not talking about something that is merely relevant to us for reasons academic or reasons analytical, but we're talking about something that is the reality of our lives. And I think that is the first thing that we have to acknowledge, that it's not a distant issue. It is an issue, if you want to call it an issue, that we grow up in and witness right from the first moment of our birth or our existence in this world. So, to take our kind of conversation away slightly from the kind of broader themes that have been touched upon and will be touched upon later on by our final speaker, I would like to kind of personalize this conversation and to kind of narrate a very small anecdote that happened to that I experienced recently. So, a few weeks back or a month back, my aunt, my mother's elder sister, we have a WhatsApp group in our family because both my parents are in prison. My father has been in prison for the last 30 years, since 1993. And the only time I have seen him has been in prison. And the only time I have met him has been in prison. And the only way we have communicated has been through calls, which are no longer allowed, but letters, which are also no longer allowed. He has been denied access to pen and paper. He was first denied access to books because books is what has kept him sane for the last 3 decades during his imprisonment. He's in solitary right now. And after being denied access to books, what he was left with was pen and paper. And so they thought that there's something that he's still able to hold on to. So let's also deprive him of that. So the Indian state also took away the pen and paper from him, which is why we can no longer exchange letters. With mother, it's slightly a more fortunate situation that she's allowed to call once in a month for 10 minutes. 10 minutes, obviously, that I spend all of my month looking forward to and waiting for. And in those 10 minutes, she's told that she cannot talk in her own language to her own child by a stranger who is standing right beside her, telling her what she can and cannot talk about to her own child. So, occupation for us is not something that we have read about in books. It's not something that, it's not a theory for us. It's not something you read in newspapers. But as I said, it's something that we have intimately witnessed all our lives, where strangers dictate the most fundamental things in your life. So, and this is not, by no means is my story or my experience, whatever I'm narrating, by no means is this exceptional. So, whatever I'm telling you is witnessed and experienced by so many other Kashmiris. Fathers in prison. If my father is in prison for more than 30 years, there are other stories too where people have been in prison for more than 2 decades. Just to take another name, we have a Kashmiri prisoner known as Ghulam Qadir Bhatt, who has been in prison for more than 26 years. His wife passed away while he was in prison. His mother passed away while he was in prison. And obviously, he was not allowed to attend their funeral. So, this is by no means an exceptional story, and I wanted to give that clarification. Um, so recently, my mother's elder sister passed away. So we have this WhatsApp group that we have created called Updates, and in this group, we only share updates pertaining to my mother or my father, how their health condition is, in prisons, what happened to their court case, and all of these things. It's a group specifically and only for discussing them. And in the morning, a few weeks back, one morning, we received a message where my uncle, who had visited my father, gave an update about my father, the fact that he can no longer walk without assistance, the fact that he is partially not able to see anymore because of his condition of glaucoma, um, and the fact that he requires urgent surgery, otherwise, he could lose his sight, and all of these different things he mentioned. And just a minute or two after this message was received, one of this aunt that I'm just mentioning, my mother's elder sister, she sent a voice note and she was very emotional, breaking down and talking about how they won't let him go until he's completely broken. And that's part of the reason why people are detained, to break them psychologically and spiritually, because they're not being domesticated, they're not accepting um, compromise, because otherwise all of these prisoners, when we talk about Kashmiri prisoners, and this is also very important, that when we talk about the suffering and when we talk about the pain and we talk about the grief, to also remember that these are not just stories that should evoke sympathy, that should evoke you grieving, that should evoke melancholy, but these are also stories that you should be completely moved by the sheer power and strength and conviction of these people. So if somebody has been in prison for years and years, and they are in prison because they are part of Kashmiri liberation struggle against the occupation, whichever way they have chosen to resist and by any means necessary, all of these people could actually leave the prison and get a safe passage to their home and also get a set of privileges if they compromise. This is always on table. Most of the times it is on table. And for most of the prisoners, they are actually offered by the state implicitly or explicitly that you can go home, just sign this document that you won't talk about things pertaining to the political realm, you won't discuss these things, you won't um, antagonize the state, all of these things, and you can walk home. Silence being the cost, obviously. And most of the people are not accepting these terms. So they are not in prison only for us to sympathize with them, but also to learn from them, but also to be absolutely moved by their courage and steadfastness. Having said that, so we listened to the voice note of my aunt, who was basically cursing the occupation and praying for father's release. And half an hour later, she suffered from a brain hemorrhage and she um, was in coma for 2 days, and then she passed away. And her daughter, who I spoke to, she told me that when she heard the voice note about my father, she kept on crying and she told her daughter that I need to vent out, open the windows, I'm not able to breathe. And because she was a patient of hypertension. So then she passed away after being in coma for 2 or 3 days. Now, how do we understand this death? Is this a natural death? Did she die because of a brain hemorrhage or did the occupation kill her? And part of the reason why I narrated this whole story about my aunt, who otherwise is not a prisoner, is to kind of drive home this point that when we talk about political prisoners, we're not just talking about, as I said previously, distant issues, but we're talking about this person with whose life thousands of other lives are intertwined. And so, this woman, this aunt who I lost, did not die a natural death. It's the grief of occupation, it's the violence of occupation that killed her. So, and this is not the first time we have lost somebody like that in my family. My father's mother, my grandmother, When in the 90s, my father was first detained under Public Safety Act, which really is an occupation safety act, kind of safeguards the occupation and not the public. But under this act, when father was detained first and subjected to brutal torture, the details of which I do not want to go into, but everything that you could imagine that colonial states do was done to him. And then his bloodied clothes used to be sent home for washing. But the purpose was really not for those clothes to be washed, but it was really to traumatize and torment the family. And my grandmother, she used to receive these clothes, and she kept on receiving them from months and months. And later on, she also died very similarly. Now, this is something that we have to understand, that these stories of prisoners who are jailed for their involvement in liberation struggle, and many a times we hear people saying that, they're innocent, they haven't done anything. I don't know. I mean, the first question that I would ask is innocent by whose standards? Innocence from whose gaze? If you talk about the occupier, then obviously, given the absolute immorality of all projects of occupation, that these are not innocent people. These are people who are actually challenging the occupation and fighting against the occupation and threatening the existence of occupation.
Mhm.
So they are not people who are innocent if you adopt the definition of the occupier, but we question that definition, obviously. So that is the first thing that we have to also keep in mind, that when we speak of these people, these are people who are in prison for a very meaningful purpose, and that purpose is the purpose of resisting occupation. And right now, we have numerous Kashmiri women who are in jails, and these women include women between the ages of 60 and 70, women who are on oxygen support, including my mother. And they also include very young women. We have Sophie Fahmida, for example. She was in her early 30s or late 20s when she was jailed. And I know her personally, and she was one of the most proactive person I knew in my life. And she used to play sports with me, and she used to take care of me. She raised me in the absence of mother when mother was detained, because father has been in prison all my life. So when mother was detained as well, she's also spent 15 years of her life intermittently in different prisons. So Hamida used to raise me, but this time around she has also been detained, and they are in detention since the past 7 or 8 years. So this woman, when she was jailed first, she was the embodiment of health. And right now, in Tihar jail of New Delhi, she's on a wheelchair and she's bedridden, and she requires an urgent back surgery, which obviously is being denied to her, and she cannot move without assistance. So, this 32-year-old girl who happened to go into prison completely healthy, what happened to her? I mean, it's not like um, it was a natural regression of health. No. There were conditions that are created by the Indian state in prisons where Kashmiri prisoners are gradually and systematically taken to their own deaths. And when they finally do die, as in the case of our recent martyr Ashraf Sehrai, who was similarly murdered by the Indian state in prison, or Altaf Shah. All of these people are denied medical care and health care until they can no longer survive, because yes, they are spiritually strong, yes, they are mentally strong, but human being at the end of the day is also his body. So they break the bodies, and then when they are on the verge of their death, they're either taken to hospitals, or their family members are called and they are told to, if they're lucky, as was mentioned previously, they are told to take their bodies. Alternatively, even the bodies might not be returned, as it happens with our liberation fighters who resist India's occupation. Their bodies are not even returned to their family members, and they are buried God knows where, if their bodies do survive India's violence. So I
You
think this
started
is
off,
something that, yeah.
so you started off by making a very, important point for all of us to remember, which is each one of these people are individuals. They're not just numbers or cases. And each one of them has, although, obviously they have their hopes, dreams, and families, but every single one of them has their own story of torture and oppression and being in prison that they've suffered through. So it's really important to note that. And we also see again how it's not just about the prisoners, but it extends outside the prisoners to the families. you know, it instills fear in entire communities. And like you mentioned, it works also to break that resistance and that spirit of resistance. So honestly, I cannot fathom what you and your family are going through. And we pray for your parents' freedom from imprisonment. May Allah grant him patience, you know, your father patience and steadfastness. You know, now we have our final speaker, Zarifa Baroud. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter's European Center for Palestine Studies. Her dissertation focuses on the colonial origins of Israel's carceral regime. Zarifa received her master's degree in policy studies from the University of Washington, where she researched American aid programs to the Israeli military. She writes for outlets like Al Jazeera. Please welcome Zarifa.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I
Walaikum
want
salam.
to start off by thanking Ahmed for his powerful testimony. May Allah free and grant liberation to all of his family members, and elevate the soul of his aunt who was murdered. Allah yarhamha. So kind of going based off of what Jenna said, she provided some amazing figures and some really important figures. And then Ahmed kind of gave some human context of the actual human impact of these policies that we see in both Kashmir and Palestine. I'm going to start off by providing some additional figures, but again, as we're absorbing these numbers, also recognizing that they're not numbers. And I understand that that can be hard because these are overwhelming figures, like the ones that we see coming out of Gaza right now. Sometimes it's difficult to truly fathom the actual impact of these numbers and these losses. So starting, before October 7th, and I think we always need to preface this conversation with that this did not begin on October 7th. Nor did these policies begin on October 7th. Since 1967, since the beginning of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, again, before October 7th, these numbers have drastically increased. Approximately 20% of the entire Palestinian population in the occupied territories, including 40% of all Palestinian men, have experienced Israeli detention, have been subjected to Israeli detention and the horrors that that experience assumes. They're either detained administratively without charge or trial, or through the sham that is Israel's military court system, which produces a conviction rate of 99.7%. And again, will deal out sentences like 20 plus years for charges of stone throwing and things of this nature. Now this number has exceeded 10,000, and it could well be far over 10,000. Again, the numbers coming out of Gaza are, there's no actual way of tracking these numbers. There's not detention orders being dealt out to Gazan detainees the way that they traditionally are in the occupied West Bank. And were dealt out in Gaza before Israel's disengagement. But these numbers, the ones that we so far have confirmed, which are somewhat or over 10,000, we're not completely sure. A Ramallah-based Palestinian organization called the Palestinian Prisoner Society is saying that this is a 100% increase in arrests compared to this time last year. The Prisoners and Ex-Prisoners Affairs Authority, also in occupied Palestine, is saying it's a 130% increase in arrests and detention in recent years. And Tal Steiner from the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel is saying it's a 200% increase in detention from any normal year under military occupation. Now, again, these numbers, this 10,000 number, this 10,000 plus number, does not account for the over 2 million Gazans currently captive in the world's largest open-air prison. Nor does it account for Palestinians under constant Israeli military curfew. It's important to put into context other forms of confinement that are not recorded in the same way. Are Palestinians in the occupied West Bank that are contained by an entire network of checkpoints and walls, Palestinians enduring nightly raids on their homes, being brutalized along with their families by the IOF and Shin Bet, or Israeli intelligence agencies. Or Palestinians detained inside Gaza, as I mentioned, that are routinely used as human shields and utilized for the sake of partaking in military operations and used as bait for fighters, or testing homes and buildings for booby traps before the military enters. We usually understand prisons, especially colonial relics like the ones that exist in Palestine, as simply tools of repression. But I want to take this a step further. Israel's carceral apparatus throughout the occupied territories, which pervades every sector of Palestinian life, has proven itself to be far more than simply a tool of repression and state colonial control, but rather a tool of settler elimination, producing and imposing social death, as termed by Akili Membe, en masse, and increasingly biological death. There was actually a new estimate from Anadolu Agency that's saying that the number of Palestinian detainees that have been killed or died in custody since October 7th has now potentially exceeded 41. There are currently 41 identified victims, and 39 of them have not been returned to their families. Again, this policy, which we saw, which was spoken about by Jenna, but also by our Kashmiri representatives here today. This is also a colonial relic in itself. This it's a British policy, the corpse detention policy, which again far preceded October 7th, and as we're learning today, is far preceding various settler colonial contexts around the world. So we can assume many things about Israel's consistent and systemic incarceration, detention, torture, terror of Palestinians, clearly to repress and to punish their colonial subjects, but also, as Frantz Fanon talks about in Wretched of the Earth, he says, the settler's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. Israel's prison system poignantly reflects this core settler principle in nearly every way, through systemic torture, mistreatment, the increasingly deplorable conditions in Israeli prisons. And on top of this, Israel is growing increasingly desperate to maintain its control and its grip on Palestine. Because as Fanon continues in that passage, he says, it's also the natives' work to imagine all possible methods for destroying the settler. And this has been put to practice every single day inside and outside of Israeli confinement. Resistance inside Israeli prison continues through the incredible endurance of Palestinian prisoners. The resistance in Gaza, in the Gaza concentration camp, continues in an unprecedented manner, as does diaspora resistance, not just around Gaza, but around the cause of our prisoners and their liberation, throughout Palestinian history. Our prisoners have served as a compass for our national struggle, particularly in the most convoluted, confusing, painful, divisive moments in that history. And for the most part, I really do believe that that unified vision has continued inside and outside of Palestine. And it's only pervading diaspora organizing even stronger. That we not only are demanding a ceasefire, and that Palestinian resistance is going to continue until not just a ceasefire, but until Gaza is free, till the prisons are emptied, not simply a prisoner deal, but until prisons are emptied, and Palestinians really do achieve true liberation.
Thank you, Zarifa, for you've really the numbers you mentioned at the beginning are honestly staggering, and it's incomprehensible how much suffering can be inflicted on a population. We see that systematic torture is not just an act of cruelty, it's embedded within the framework that seeks to legitimize the subjugation of Palestinians. So, like you said, they're trying to break the spirit, but it's only making it stronger, and there's more solidarity. And I think, although the level that it's at right now is unprecedented, I think also the shift in the narrative and the view and around the world and the people coming together around the globe is also unprecedented. So
Absolutely.
hopefully there is some light at the end of the tunnel. We have a few questions from our viewers. So I'm gonna start with one that is actually addressed to a speaker. That way, when I mention the other ones that are not specifically addressed, any one of our panelists can take up that question. So the first question is from Detention al-Islam. The question is to Dr. Athar Zia, that how do you view the role of social media in shaping the modern Kashmiri resistance movement? Does it have the potential to mobilize effectively, or does it risk oversimplifying a complex issue?
Thank you so much for that question, Tajammul. I know that largely when we look at social media, a lot of people think it's a very shallow engagement because people are digitally engaging. There is nothing happening on ground. But I think in the last 1 year, we've realized how much social media is helping in create an engagement, a digital engagement, and then also have some implications on the ground. Vis-a-vis Kashmir, I mean, we've seen what's the way the Palestinian social media and how people are giving solidarity from all across the world. And there were some remnants also in 2016 when I kind of began realizing that there might be more potential to it than there might be more credit to it than we give it. When here in the United States, there was this pipeline, the Dakota pipeline at Standing Rock, and there were people who were allying with the indigenous people who were at that time fighting the corporation for not allowing them to lay the pipeline across their sacred lands. And I saw that people all across the world, even India for that matter, they were kind of signing in to throw off the police and kind of like make it seem as if they were all at the location and giving solidarity to people. And that kind of like brought it to light. That was 2016, 2017. With regards to Kashmir, I mean, you can create awareness, and you can create any kind of awareness. That it's and what we see from the Indian government with the engineering of social media, with propagating influencers, propagating voices that are presenting India in a positive light, that are also kind of like very touristy and kind of like the influencers who are propagating this idea that Kashmir is this aesthetic place where you can go and you can experience the mountains, you can make it, commodification basically, and tourism is a servile economy. So that has been also created as part of the social media by the nation state of India. So what Kashmiris have been doing, they have been using social media very judiciously ever since it made a foray long back in the early 2000s and like 2005, 2006. But it can only get so much traction. I mean, there can be awareness, and I've thought about it. We are looking into digital ethnography, where people are kind of like engaging with people from the diaspora so that we can kind of create open communication lines. You can use it any which way you want, but as long as the government has the Indian occupying power has that kind of a possession of everything that happens, especially the freedom of expression inside Kashmir. That's the first casualty of all of this. People are not able to speak honestly. People are not able to speak about even the smallest complaint that they might have, as they say. So I can see it only going so far, but that doesn't mean we do not use this tool. We know this is also a tool that imperialism has created for its own sake. It's not really for people like us. And we see the implications of that as the genocide in Gaza is occurring in this moment. We see how much repression and how much the repression is not only like people can't speak, but also on technology itself, like how much technology will be allowed inside and how can people access this, the phones and everything, and even the SIM cards. And so all of that plays out in Kashmir in a different way as well. But then there is also this piece that no one can speak. I mean, we talked about, all of us here talked about the social media, and even a small emoji was posted by a woman on one of the posts that was talking about this, the chief of the army staff of India who died in an in a crash, a plane crash, in a helicopter crash, sorry. And she just posted an emoji, kind of like celebratory emoji, and she was suspended, and I don't know what happened to her case later on. So it can only go so far. And also like the civil society and the human rights organizations, which would have spoken about this, and also the rest of the world, I think we are all kind of like tied up. So we can use it. We know that the master's tools are not going to bring down the master's house, so to speak. We can only do so much, but there are judicious ways in which we can form transnational solidarities. And we have seen that happen in 2016, 2017. As we began actively thinking about Palestine and Kashmir together, and we have several resources if you might want to share it with your audience later on. We saw that there was like an open communication happening on social media between Palestinian activists and Kashmiri activists. But again, people stopped that because it would have led to more conversation and maybe exchange of information and resources and kind of getting to know about each other. So long story short, there is a great potential, but after everything is said and done, we have to know the limitations of this, because this is also a tool of imperial globality. It is going to serve the master as much less than how it is going to serve us who are the subjugated, politically subjugated, not in our spirit and not in our soul. So that's my answer, and I'm sure the young people here have to add much more to that.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna ask the next question. Maybe one of our Palestinian guests can answer it, because we have quite a few coming up also for Kashmir. So the question is, where are the human rights advocating? This is from Tahira Hamid Sheikh. Where are the human rights advocating organizations when such open human rights of detainees are being violated? So please feel free to answer.
I guess I'll try to take an answer to that question. I mean, the reality of the situation is that these human rights organizations are also being targeted. 2 years ago, 5 Palestinian organizations here in Palestine were designated as terrorist organizations by the occupation, and their doors were forcefully sealed shut. And there was an order by the occupation's high court deeming these organizations as terrorist organizations, and ordering that they no longer continue the work that they're doing. And all of the work that they're doing, and Adamir is one of these organizations that was deemed as a terrorist organization. And in reality, all of the work that we're doing is just advocating for Palestinian rights, and for basic human rights to be implemented, and for Palestinians to have the right to even live. We have the Mir that represents Palestinian detainees. You have other organizations such as Al-Haq that represents and advocates for human rights in general. Other organizations, DCIP, which would be the Defense for Children International Palestine, they advocate solely for children, and this organization was deemed as a terrorist organization by the occupation. So the organizations are here, they're documenting, they're working, they're doing the work that they can do. However, the occupation will take any measures that they can in order to silence all of these organizations.
No,
Yeah,
that's true. No,
in
and I
addition
would
to
say
that,
that.
sorry,
Oh,
just
go.
to note, also most recently, Samudun, in the United States was designated as a foreign terrorist organization, which is a Palestinian organization which advocates and raises funds and things like this to support Palestinian detainees and their families. So it's interesting, out of a lot of different Palestinian orgs in the US, this is one of the first that the US government went after.
Yeah, no, I was actually, yeah, well, that's what I was gonna say. It's not only does the occupation, deem these groups as terrorist groups, but there are also proxy countries like the US and Canada also go after them and designate them as terrorist groups. So it makes it more difficult for a lot of these human rights organizations that are actually trying to stop human rights abuses and stand for international law. They get labeled, unfortunately, and designated in that way. So I'll ask the next question. This is for either of our Kashmiri guests. Is the recent elections of Juma and Kashmir going to make any difference in terms of restoring lost human rights of activists? And I just want to say, sorry, everybody's been great with their timing, so it's not meant as anybody, but try to limit your answers to 2 minutes. That way we can get through a few of the questions that we have in a reasonable time. So please go ahead. Well, either of our Kashmiri guests can answer that question about the elections.
I think Dr. Athar would be,
I think,
because
you know
there's
what? Okay, I'll take that, don't worry. So I'm just thinking, whoever asked this question, I know that it's a genuine question, but you know what I would like to do instead of answering is just like the way Ahmed is laughing at this moment. I would like to join him in this laughter. And this is a sad amusement for Kashmiris. The elections inside Kashmir are really a camouflage for military occupation. They are illicit in nature, they're illegal in nature, and whoever takes part in those elections, they're client politicians who do India's bidding. And very, very sadly, the recent government that has been elected, the administration, the local faces, they're just local faces. Their lineage and genesis is client politics. That's what they do. And because Kashmir has been converted into a union territory to be ruled straight from New Delhi in 2019. It has happened in the past as well. It's no more a state. It doesn't have much powers. The Legislative Assembly that was recently elected, and that's not as powerful in lawmaking anymore. And most of the people have begun calling this person at the helm, who is the chief minister now, as a sarpanch chief minister, which means as if he's kind of like handling the local county, so to speak. On the other side of this, also we have to understand why do Kashmiris take part in elections? And India does use it as an endorsement for its rule inside Kashmir, telling the rest of the world that, hey, Kashmiris take part in elections. First and foremost, every occupied territory deserves governance. And I don't really, the international law that we always invoke, we now invoke it with more sarcasm and with more criticism than before. But according to that, any occupied territory has to be governed. So Kashmiris, from the very get-go, if someone has taken part in elections, it's always been for governance reasons, not for the reasons of endorsing India or giving up their politics of self-determination and independence. So we have to keep in mind. Second, these elections that are held inside Kashmir, they are illicit. They should not have been held from 1951 onwards, but that's a longer question. And why did people recently take part in elections? That was because the current government is much more brazen and is much more open about persecution of Kashmiris in the name of Hindu supremacy, especially Muslim Kashmiris. So they had strong proxy elements and direct elements inside the Kashmiri client politics. And that's what Kashmiris got scared of, and which is why they went out in droves to take part in the elections. It's almost like they have wanted a lesser evil to be around them rather than the bigger evil that is rank politics, that is kind of connected deeply to him. After everything is said and done, they're all connected to Hindutva politics and client politics of India inside Kashmir. But this was kind of seen as if they're going, if there's a saying in Kashmiri that if they're going to kill me, they might leave me in shade rather than in the sun. So it's kind of that equation, that if they kill us, they might leave us in shade rather than in sun. So that's been the choice for Kashmiris from 1947 onwards, to choose between lesser evils. So this is not an endorsement for India. And I do not think that this government is going to do anything differently, except it's also engineered by India and deployed by India to do its dirty work. And I do not know what they have to do next. Otherwise, they will not allow this system to emerge again. And that's what Kashmiris are waiting with bated breath and with a lot of fear.
We can see the questions our viewers are asking are very thought-provoking and require, each one of them maybe its own discussions, but we thank them for that, and thank you for your answer. The next question is directed at Brother Ahmed from Muddathir Nazar, and his question is: sometimes we happen to discriminate between the expendable detainees, like the armed fighters and pro-freedom fighters who have actually committed a crime, he has in quotes, and those who are law-abiding, and then we campaign for the release of the latter while being silent about the former. Can you speak about that?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I did very briefly mention when I was talking about the idea of innocence, when we say that, this Kashmiri prisoner is innocent, he didn't do anything. What is very implicit in that, and usually it's not always said from a place of kind of a sinister intention, where people say, why have you jailed him? He's innocent. But sometimes it kind of does show the latent idea that what is actually meant is that he did not resist. So why did you jail him? He was not fighting against you. He was not out on the street, or he was not resisting you through arms, which is a perfectly legitimate and just thing to do in living under occupation. So why did you jail him? So the idea of innocence itself has to be problematized when we say that this person is innocent. So why did you jail him? He didn't do anything. So that kind of speaks partially to the question. But yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk about Kashmiri prisoners, there is undeniably an asymmetry in who gets in who is talked about and who is not talked about. Usually, for example, the journalists who are jailed are talked about a lot. The human rights defenders who are jailed are talked about a lot. And ironically, the people who their documentation work was based on are not talked about. So that is in some ways the irony, in the sense that it's always easy to talk about a journalist because he's a journalist. It's always easy to talk about a human rights activist because his case is more palatable to liberal sensibilities. But now that you have a Kashmiri who is actually, for example, who has been involved in armed struggle against occupation and has been in prison over 2 decades, now all of a sudden it's not very convenient anymore to talk about this person because his case and his story is not palatable to liberal sensibilities, where you have to be the perfect victim. You should not have resisted. You should not have picked up a stone. You should not have picked up a gun. You should not look visibly Muslim. Also, in the case of Kashmir, all of these different kind of things coming together to make that perfect victim. And that is something that definitely we see in the case of Kashmir as well. And from my little reading in the case of Palestine as well, that you have to be this very ideal victim for you to be talked about. So, for example, in the case of Kashmir, just to kind of conclude on this, certain prisoners, certain female prisoners, for example, are not talked about much because their politics is seen as radical, so to speak. They are anti-colonial. They are unapologetically Muslim. They're talking about liberation struggle. They're talking about embracing all kinds of resistances. And as opposed to this, if you have an alternative, for example, case where somebody is merely documenting human rights violations and they are jailed or they are subjected to any form of state persecution, people always want to take that case up because it's easier to talk about, especially in the diaspora, in the US or elsewhere. So while I'm not necessarily questioning the intent of the people who do it, they might actually be very sincere people, but it's very important to recognize that even when I am speaking here, that also reflects a certain measure of privilege I have, that I'm talking about my parents. And I'm telling you that there are nameless people, nameless not because they don't have names, nameless because taking their name comes with a cost as well. So most people just don't want to talk about them. So, yeah, absolutely, there is that binary that does exist in Kashmir of certain people not being ideal victims because of their kind of, the lack of a better word, very strongly professed agency, and certain people being seen as passive victims who can evoke better sympathy. So I think that does exist. Yeah.
Okay, you know, with that, that's a good question. And maybe Zarifa, you could also discuss it from a Palestinian perspective a little bit and how you know, it's becoming increasingly difficult to navigate speaking about Palestine and you know, the way they label Hamas and other resistance groups, even though, you know, we know under international law the way the law works and the protections of, you know, the responsibilities of the occupier and the protections of the occupied and those sort of things. So I'll let you speak about that a little bit, just if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of what Ahmed said really resonated from a Palestinian perspective. I think especially in the US, the reason why the struggle of prisoners really is important to me as an individual, but also within academic organizing spaces, is because so often the human rights of Palestinians could be focused on in one degree, but particularly the subject of prisoners before October 7th, at least, was often kind of rejected, even in progressive organizing spaces, liberal organizing spaces, because that forced activists and people that wanted, in some sense, to ally themselves with Palestine to confront the issue of resistance. You can't talk about prisoners and not talk about resistance, whether it's the reason they've been detained in the first place, or whether it's the resistance they partake in within Israeli prisons. I think that's something that's particularly relevant as we continue to have these conversations and develop terminology around what we're seeing right now in Gaza, but also within the realm of Israeli incarceration. People often begin to refer to Palestinian detainees as hostages, and I'm honestly not sure how I totally feel about this, because as Ahmed sort of mentioned, this idea of the innocence of some prisoners and the guilt of others. I don't know if I feel completely comfortable imposing this idea upon our prisoners that they're passive or submissive, as kind of the nature of a hostage may seem. Many of them are in prison for a reason, right? For the Israeli occupation authorities, these reasons are they're a threat to the settler project. And this is a powerful and righteous thing to be targeted for. So I think taking away, sorry, I was reading the comments, taking away that power and that agency from the Palestinian resistance inside prison, Palestinian resistance behind bars, I feel does them an injustice.
Like you said, this is evolving and we're learning as we go, especially in the new context of what's taking place. So, you know, the good thing is I feel like we are learning fast and we are developing well. You know, it's a long-term. I think people need to realize that both of these conflicts are long-term, are going to need long-term planning in order to come to a solution. You know, there are actually a lot of great questions, and I wish we can go through all of them, but I really urge our guests, anybody that has a question, you could reach out to any of our panelists and ask them if there's something specific that you want to ask them about, because, you know, mashallah, they have a wealth of knowledge, and, you know, you should really take advantage of that. What I want to ask now is for each one of our panelists to make just 1 minute final remarks before we conclude. And we'll just go with the same order that we started with. So Dr. Ether Zia, if you want to go ahead with your final remark.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to young people and see these evolving ideas and see how we can I can see how we are like passing the baton and moving on and hopefully see the end of these oppressions. One thing that I want to say is that the colonial regimes, they will give you a vocabulary. They will give you a vocabulary of innocence. They will give you a vocabulary of what is a good victim, what is a bad victim. And I think that is a playbook, the playbook of colonialism, the playbook of whether that be colonialism as is unfolding in the occupying territories in the moment, or whether that be the colonialism / neo-colonialism that is operating inside Kashmir in this moment. The playbook is the same, and they're also sharing knowledge and information visibly between the Israeli settler state and India as it's unfolding in Kashmir. So that's what we have seen. These oppressions are connected. There is a way, there is a language in academia, outside academia, and as Ahmed and everyone reminded, that this is not nameless, this is not faceless, there are people behind it, and it is a very human issue, and it's the humanity of people that is kind of allowing us to do all of this and talk about all of this, and the agency and the mobilization that happens on ground. There is a way to talk about this neo-colonialism. This siege exists from Palestine to Kashmir, and every other oppression that we see from the Rohingyas, the Turtle Island here, where I stand in this moment, where Zarifa also is, this oppression is the same beast of classic colonialism ending and neo-colonialism emerging. So I think that is the idiom that we have to use, in which UN is also implicated. It makes us talk through the language of UN, but that is not our friend. It makes us talk through the language of international law. That is not our friend. So we have to problematize all of those institutions while people are on the ground protesting against the genocide in Gaza, and also protesting and also understanding the oppression. So I feel like these conversations are so important for us to have, and cutting across these barriers. We are not good victims or bad victims. We are not good resistors or bad resistors. We are still the colonial subjects, as Zarifa mentioned. This is the British colonialism that kind of like has several iterations all across the world. This is a very Eurocentric Westphalian system that is being imposed again through the idiom of neoliberalism. And this is death by democracy. This is slow killing and incremental genocide in different places by weaponization of democratic ideals. So I think we have a language to talk about this. We are developing that common idiom, and I can only see strength moving forward. And I know that this is being built on a lot of blood that is being shed in this moment. And I'm just hoping that we move towards just strength, all of us.
I mean.
Thank you.
Honestly, I did not want to comment between everybody's final statement, but it's so true what you're saying about the colonial language, and the way they set the parameters and what the areas you're allowed to move through and what you say. And you see that also with other things like for instance, the kufiya, or I saw a video about with a man that was removed there was a sports match in Toronto. He was just wearing a hat that had the Palestine map on it, and he was kicked out of the stadium. So these are all, I believe, part of the same, structures and systems that are not just about, the ethnic cleansing and genocide and forced displacement and occupation, but also about erasing the history, the people, the image. But again, it's only making it stronger. It's made everybody Palestinian. It's hopefully, Kashmiris, as it picks up steam with it's the information, a lot of people are uniting around these causes instead of the opposite way. So just again, final comments from Jenna Abu Hasna.
Thank you again for everyone here and listening. And I just want to say that I completely agree with Dr. Ather on everything that she said. These occupational regimes are completely 100% connected. And if they're not brought to a complete end, they will expand, and other regimes as well will expand. It will not just be contained in Palestine, in Gaza, in Kashmir, as we see what's going on in Lebanon. The occupation's crimes will continue to grow and be committed against many different people, and they will not stop just in Palestine, especially if they're not put to an end or are not faced with pushback from the entire world. And I just want to add as well, the thought process of thinking that these occupational regimes are completely connected. When it comes to the Palestinian cause, it is very important not to divide each cause on its own. So to speak about prisoners on their own, or to speak about the genocide on its own, or to speak about the violations going on in the West Bank, it is very necessary that in our speech, in our language, in our advocating, in our way of thinking, even in our everyday life, that this is all eventually, this falls under one overarching a sort of bridge or umbrella. This is not something separate. That's exactly what the occupation would want. They would want you to focus on one thing and forget the other. But it's very important to connect it all under the same struggle. And when advocating and speaking about the violations, the language used needs to be in a way where it completely connects all of the crimes, and it completely connects the different aspects of the Palestinian struggle, or the struggles in general in Kashmir as well, into one sort of aim, and that is obviously the end of the occupation, the end of the crimes, and the end of these regimes being allowed to continue with full impunity. And that's all. Thank you.
That's again, I don't want to say everything, but it's true what you're saying. And I just want to remind people that, along with Kashmir and Palestine, there's also what our Uyghur brothers and sisters are going through in China. We have what's going on in Sri Lanka, the Rohingya, obviously, situation. And again, we need to always remember that there's also a First Nations issue, the indigenous peoples around the world, in Canada and in Turtle Island, what's going on with them. And like you said, these are all interconnected, and we really have to start viewing them as one issue. Brother Ahmed bin Qasim, your final thoughts and remarks.
Yeah, I think it's especially when it comes to Kashmir and Palestine, the intimacy of India and Israel, as opposed to, it's not just in terms of the ideology and as an abstraction, but also in the realm of materiality. So, for example, if you recently we heard that in Gaza there was a shell that was found. Obviously, the shell took the lives of Palestinians, and on this shell, the words that were engraved were made in India. So the shell was made in India, and when Palestinian laborers workers were expelled by Israel recently, Indian laborers were brought in to actually fill in for them. And in Kashmir, the security infrastructure, quote unquote security infrastructure, the colonial infrastructure in prisons, and the military, the vehicles that are used, and a lot of ammunition comes from Israel. So there are Kashmiri rebels and Kashmiri armed fighters who are fighting for liberation, and Kashmiri prisoners whose imprisonment and whose death, in some ways, is very directly and intimately connected with Israel. So we're not talking just in terms of an abstract kind of similarity of these two projects, but also their active collaboration in the realm of the material. So I think that is very important. And just a small and a very quick intervention at the end. I think when October 7th happened, a lot of people said that it was Israel's own doing, and that was impossible, that it was impossible that something like that could have happened without Israel actually willing for it to happen. And we also hear this in Kashmir many a times whenever Kashmiri liberation struggle is able to hurt India. It's always assumed that it's impossible, that India would have allowed itself to be hurt. So there must be some covert or hidden hand of the Indian state in this event. And what is assumed always is the invincibility of these colonial states, that they cannot be hurt, that they cannot be harmed, that they cannot be defeated, that there are no cracks in their power, that whenever they are hurt, it's because they are allowing themselves to be hurt. I think it's very important for us to rethink that. I'm not denying here the extensiveness of the power of colonial states, be it India or Israel. But what I'm saying here is that this power is neither without cracks nor is it impervious to resistance. It's not as though these states cannot be defeated. You have to strategize, and that's a separate question. But you first have to accept the possibility of imagining a world without these projects. But if you don't do that, and if you say that it's just impossible, then there's no conversation to be had. And you look at history, um, to have a position like that is untenable. You have graveyards of empires all around, but in some ways they've also continued. So I think that is something that I would like to end with.
That's really great words. In the Quran it says, وَلَقَدْ نَصَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ بِبَدْرٍ وَأَنْتُمْ أَذِلَّةٌ. Right? And this is, I think, a Muslim perspective that we have to be optimistic. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave victory to the people in Badr when they were really, it should have been, they should have been wiped out. So we don't depend on, we depend obviously on doing our work, but then at the end of the day, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that provides the ultimate victory. And we got to remember that he holds all the power. Zarifa Baroud, if you'd like to give your final comments and remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, going off of what your comment just now, I think it's important, especially because I think I'm talking to a primarily Muslim audience, to not underestimate the power of our dua, especially coming from the voice and the mouth of the oppressed. There's authentic hadith that said that there is no veil between the dua of the oppressed and their Lord. So I think remembering this when we're praying for liberation, when we're advocating and when we're organizing in every other way, our organizing is incomplete without our Rabb, without our deen, without our dua. Something I would like to just mention at the very end, not only should in Palestine organizing and similarly in Kashmir organizing, should we be centering the voices of our leaders and our resistance behind bars, but also those that elevate their voices and stand unequivocally by them. I want to just bring light to my good friend Wafa Al-Udaini, a Gaza journalist that I met when I was there in 2022. She was killed earlier this month along with her husband and her children. She dedicated her whole life to teaching Gaza youth how to write, how to appeal to international media outlets, but also centered Palestinian prisoners in her discourse. And it really made her an inspiration to me and so many in Gaza. So remembering her in your du'as and in your organizing, and remembering that there are so many, this idea also of centering our prisoners. I think we need to expand the definition of prisoners. As we're centering Palestinian prisoners, we need to center captives in Gaza, captives in all over the West Bank. Yeah, thank you so much for everyone that came and listened, and thank you all for your solidarity.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. It's like I said before, there's just so much information and knowledge that you guys provide. We really need to take advantage of that. As we conclude, I just want to share a few final thoughts that I had. I'm continually struck by the parallels in the struggles facing these regions and the other regions that I mentioned, like the Uyghurs. The stories we've heard today remind us of the human cost of occupation and the resilience of those who resisted. It's my hope that by bringing these narratives together, we can foster greater understanding and solidarity across borders. We invite the audience to reflect on these testimonies and engage in dialogue about how we can support those fighting against these injustices. Thank you to all our speakers for your contributions today. And please stay tuned for other web. I just wanted to say thank you all, and special thanks to Justice for All, the Justice for All team for putting this together as well. Thank you.